You ever watch this guy on television?
You all were not telling the truth, and you should not be trusted.
Congressman Matt Gaetz, thank you for what you did for your country tonight.
Be offended with the Democratic whip, not House Republicans.
Like a machine, Matt Gaetz.
Welcome to Hot Takes. This is Congressman Matt Gaetz. Let's talk about the news. And the big news of the day is that Nancy Pelosi has a coronavirus bill. Not one she negotiated with the president or the administration, not one that Republicans were involved in, but really a liberal wish list of policy and spending. I'll also give updates on the latest in the General Flynn case, and we'll talk about what's going on to hold senators accountable who were engaged in a stock sell-off that I do not believe was patriotic and may not have been legal. But first, let's talk about coronavirus legislation. Republicans have been calling for some time to return to the Congress, to get to work, to make sure that the funds that we've already appropriated and printed are actually getting to the American businesses and to the American people who need provision in this time of great crisis. But instead of doing that, Nancy Pelosi and the far left wing of her party have drafted legislation that really is going nowhere in the Senate, but it shows what they're fighting for. And I think that's important. In this time when our nation needs to draw together and meet big challenges, solve our public health crisis, reinvigorate our economy, work to re-domesticate our manufacturing supply chain so that we're more resilient in the future. In a time when we need that, here's what the Democrats have proposed. A whole lot of spending. First of all, in this last legislation, or in this next legislation, I should say, Nancy Pelosi has proposed $500 billion for state governments. That's $500 billion. Now, look, I don't mind Floridians and Arizonans and Texans and everyone else stepping forward to help our fellow Americans, no matter where they live, deal with the coronavirus. But what's happening in this $500 billion bailout is that Nancy Pelosi is asking Americans all over the country to now bail out states that had problems well before coronavirus. I mean, New York State had like a $6 billion budget deficit before coronavirus. California had budget woes before coronavirus. And I just think it's a little insulting to say, like, hey, California, they've got enough money to give free health care to illegal aliens, apparently, while we still have Americans who are working to get their own health care, but somehow they expect this massive bailout that's in the legislation proposed by Nancy Pelosi. Go figure. In the state of New York, I think that their structural pension problems, their structural debt problems, the way they fund infrastructure, all could look a lot more like Florida and put New York in a stronger position. And I don't necessarily believe that Northwest Floridians, folks from states where we've had responsible spending should necessarily have to come forward and fork over the cash to places like Illinois, where they've clearly failed well before coronavirus to institute policies that put their people first. There's also $350 billion direct to local governments. Again, a whole lot of money, not a lot of accountability. We haven't had hearings on this. We haven't heard from local governments regarding utilization. It's just a way for Nancy Pelosi to fork over cash to these large urban centers and to these mayors that are politically more aligned with Democrats in most of the cases where I think this $350 billion is going to be spent. $25 billion for the United States Postal Service. I mean, it's almost like in this bill Nancy Pelosi has, there's not an institution that they haven't sought to bail out. I don't know why necessarily the coronavirus would result in the need to go and give $25 billion to the Postal Service. Obviously, we want our postal workers to be secure in their safety with protective equipment. We want to make sure that we have the right cleaning apparatus. But what this looks like instead is just a way to shuttle cash to a government enterprise that largely gets beat by the private sector in its various functions and in its applicability and value to the American people. And if anything, I've observed folks are shipping stuff more. So I don't know that we really have evidence that the United States Postal Service has suffered a $25 billion loss as a result of coronavirus. But nonetheless, we see Pelosi trying to fork over that cash. But it's not, it's not just the big ticket items on these things. Sometimes it's even the smaller amounts of money that just absolutely get in your craw. Like $25 million in this bill for migrant farm workers. Like, what is there something that has fundamentally changed about the way we grow crops in coronavirus? If there is, I guess I'm open-minded, but I'd sure like to have hearings about that. Would like to learn about why. But no, without explanation, without rationale, migrant farm workers just get $25 million. But it's not just the spending in this bill. There's some actual policy choices the legislation makes that really have nothing to do with coronavirus. They have a lot to do with socially engineering our country toward a leftist view. So let me break down one of, I think, the worst sections of the bill, the amnesty section. They call this departure delay. I guess that's the new leftist code for amnesty, so get used to hearing it. Departure delay. If you search in the Pelosi coronavirus bill for departure delay, you will find a provision that says that so long as someone was in this country by January 26th, 2020, that they are not here unlawfully. That we simply declare that if you got here by January 26th, 2020, that is not unlawful, you are here. Now, one, there is the obvious fact that that is offensive to the rule of law. It is offensive to the work of our border patrol, even the notion of having a country. But I think even more dangerously, this sets an absurd precedent that, like, whenever our nation is in a time of crisis, that instead of providing care for our people, instead of putting Americans first, that we lurch toward this notion of saying, well, you know, if you're not an American, but you're here, we're just going to say that, like, you don't have to worry about how you got here. We're just going to say that's all okay. I mean, is that what's going to happen in the next crisis? Is that what's going to happen in the next economic downturn? We cannot allow this to happen. As Republicans, it's not enough just to vote against this legislation. We have to get out and explain to the American people that there are two different sides fighting for two different things. The Republicans are fighting for American workers, American businesses, Americans who've been displaced, and ultimately we want the American experience to come back in the most vibrant way possible. Meanwhile, on the left, they're worried about securing their ability to win elections forever, reorienting the nature of our immigration policies, and finding every possible excuse to dump cash on political allies in various big states and big municipalities. So big problem, departure delay. Make sure I call on my Republican colleagues to get the information out about how devastating that would be to our country. But there's more in the amnesty policy choices in the bill. The legislation says that the illegal aliens who are in ICE detention just need to get released on their own recognizance, ROR, catch and release. I mean, it's catch and release COVID style in this legislation. I mean, the people that we have in ICE detention, Americans paid Border Patrol, ICE folks to go and make these apprehensions. Someone actually spent the time to ensure that we found these folks and that we were able to have some accounting of who came in and out of the country. But, you know, just to release them on their own recognizance is the Democrat plan. And is there anyone who really thinks once we release these people that, like, we're going to see them back for some judicial proceeding, a judicial process? Of course not. Of course not. It's just a way for them to make their case on immigration. But it's not just the amnesty provisions that offend our views on immigration. It's also what they're going to do with some of the money. The Nancy Pelosi coronavirus legislation includes within it stimulus direct payments to illegal aliens. This is crazy to me. We should secure the economic future and the economic standing of every single American before we spend the first dollar giving really an incentive for people to come here illegally. So think about it. The Republican plan is shore up our businesses, our people, our economy, and get ready for the great American relaunch. The Democrat plan is incite people over with amnesty. If they happen to be caught, release them, and then give them cash as a result of having been here. It really is a surrender by Nancy Pelosi to the most radical wings of her party who don't believe in borders, who don't believe in even having a Department of Homeland Security or ICE. Beyond illegal immigration, there are other bad policy choices made in Pelosi's bill. There's a pretty substantial jailbreak. I mean, if people are older inmates, if they are in certain conditions, there's a part of this bill that lets them out without any bond, just to walk the streets. We've already seen circumstances where these coronavirus jailbreaks have resulted in attempted murder, stabbings, rapes. So I want to see less jailbreak as a result of coronavirus, not more jailbreak. That's what the Democrats are fighting for. They've also got an element of this bill that federalizes elections. It requires 15 days of early voting and creates a federal vote-by-mail system. Now, there's been a lot of talk about vote-by-mail, and I want to spend a little time on this here. If you are a vote-by-mail voter, when you hear the president talk about voter fraud or challenges with vote-by-mail, he's not talking about the fact that if you send in your ballot, that there is a chance that it will not be counted or that it will be subject to fraud. There was an MIT study that I cited on television as having really laid out the probability of fraud being higher in a vote-by-mail setting. Here's the clip where I make that argument.
What I can say for those who choose to vote by mail is that there's a low risk that their vote will be tampered with. So people who want to vote by mail should. But in states that expand their vote by mail, there is a belief that there will be an increased opportunity for fraud. MIT professors have done studies that show that vote by mail actually has the highest propensity of fraud when compared to in-person voting or early voting.
So again, if you're a vote-by-mail voter, you can have confidence in your vote being counted. Here's where the fraud comes in. There are organizations and institutions that go out and create fake voter registration for people that are dead, for people that have moved, for people who were never alive. And then when those ballots get mailed out, the value of a real voter's vote can be diluted because when someone doesn't have to show up in person and, maybe check an ID or have some rationalizing of their identity and their ballot, you've got the opportunity for massive amounts of fraud. And so that's why I think that, in states like Florida, where we've got a pretty sound election infrastructure for the most part, now that Governor DeSantis fired the people that didn't know what they were doing down in South Florida, we've got that. I think we've got a secure vote by mail system when people submit their votes. But I do think that going to a federalized election system limits the ability of states to have robust enforcement, to have security of the ballot box, and to ensure that the people who are chosen by the voters actually get to serve in positions of public office. There's another provision of Pelosi's coronavirus bill, which actually seeks to undo provisions of the Republican tax cut legislation that created the strongest economy in the history of the United States, an economy so strong that we were really charging toward new heights and new ambitions as a nation before this invisible enemy attacked us. So here's the provision they want to change. It used to be the case before the Republican tax bill that if you got a really high local tax assessment or a really high state tax assessment, that you could deduct your state and local taxes off of your federal tax liability. So for a lot of folks, that meant that the sting of a local government or a state government taxing you to a high degree could be diminished as a consequence of that write-off. We did away with that write-off when we were in power. And the reason we did is that we wanted to create broad-based tax cuts for every American. And the state and local tax deduction could only really be realized by people who were from high-tax states or high-tax local governments. So in an effort to create broader, lower taxes for everyone, we did away with that deduction, or we substantially reformed it in a way that functionally changed the math on it. That has resulted in a tremendous amount of flight away from blue high-tax states to red low-tax states, right? I mean, why in the hell would you stay in Connecticut or New Jersey or New York with incredibly high taxes that you can no longer deduct when you could move to Florida, which I'm very proud to say is the lowest per capita state taxes in America. And I take some pride in that as the former Ways and Means Finance and Tax Chairman in the state legislature. So low-tax states like Arizona, Texas, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, they were seeing great benefit as a result of this reform in our laws that the Republicans instituted. And now, so that high tax states can continue to be high tax states without feeling the result of people voting by their feet and leaving, Nancy Pelosi wants to repeal our reforms to the state and local tax system. I oppose that as a Floridian. I oppose it as an American who wants to see lower taxes. Some weird stuff's happening in the Michael Flynn case. Judge Emmett Sullivan is refusing to allow the case to be resolved, despite the fact that the government, the Department of Justice, wants to drop charges based on the recent revelations that the pursuit of Michael Flynn was not the pursuit of justice, it was the pursuit of a setup. I mean, the whole goal of the FBI and then subsequently the Mueller probe was to create leverage with people around President Trump with the hopes that one of them would flip on President Trump and lie about him and say something that wasn't true when in fact he was innocent the whole time. So the Department of Justice realizes that the deal was a setup. It's their hope, intent to have this case resolved and over with and allow Michael Flynn to get on with his life. And weirdly, the judge in the case, Emmett Sullivan, creates this delay to allow third parties, so not the government, not General Flynn, but I guess just intermeddlers about the country, to file amicus briefs. I've practiced law. I've been involved in criminal litigation and civil litigation. And I got to tell you, I have never once seen this. I have never seen a circumstance in a criminal matter where the judge essentially invites third parties to opine on the status of the resolution of a criminal case. I mean, I don't even know if that's constitutional. I think it's certainly out of the ordinary. And in a case where there's been so much out of the ordinary with the setup of Michael Flynn, you would think and hope that the judge would accept the government's desire to not have this prosecution continue any further. So we'll follow that very closely, but certainly, suffice it to say, very, very strange. Finally, some news today in the Senate stock sell-off story. Those who've been following my social media and television appearances know that I'm sickened by the notion that it would be either Republicans or Democrats taking advantage of a crisis to protect their own losses while not being straight and honest with the American people. So we saw a number of Republicans and Democrats implicated in this, whether it was Dianne Feinstein or Chairman Richard Burr or the Georgia senator who was recently appointed, Kelly Lafleur. I don't think every fact pattern is the same. I don't think everybody necessarily deserves to be in the same bucket, but it's Kelly Lafleur, senator from Georgia, making some news today. Again, Senator Lafleur was not elected to this position. She was appointed by the governor of Georgia. Fox business reporters Charlie Gasparino and Linda Moynihan are reporting that Lafleur is taking a very proactive approach to the policy side of this. She is going to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commissions, and seeking some sort of green light from them that she was innocent. Rather than awaiting the judgment of the media, she's trying to get some affirmative finding or ruling that she did not direct these stock sales, that she did not use insider information, and that she ought to be in the clear. I suspect perhaps that one reason why Senator Lafleur is taking this approach is that she is certainly trailing in the polls to Congressman Doug Collins, who I worked with on a lot of these impeachment matters on the House Judiciary Committee, and who I know quite well. So we'll see whether or not the SEC is going to give Senator Lafleur the green light that she so eagerly seeks. But it's a different story with Senator Burr. Senator Richard Burr is quintessential Washington. Been there for a long time, kind of played by Washington's rules, became the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. On February 13th, Senator Burr basically liquidates his stock portfolio. All the same time, he wrote an op-ed on foxnews.com saying America's ready for this virus. This is, essentially downplaying the impact that this would have on markets and the economy and people's lives. So it's like telling the American people one thing and then doing something else. Recently, the new news is that ProPublica is reporting that Senator Burr's brother-in-law, on the same day that Senator Burr liquidates his portfolio has a bunch of stock sell-offs as well. So, hey, only Senator Burr and his brother-in-law know whether or not there are any communications between the two of them, either directly or through intermediaries. And if there are, that is going to be some really damning evidence in a potential criminal investigation of Senator Burr. And by the way, we already know, based on reporting, that the FBI is investigating Senator Burr for potential insider trading. Now, why is that so damning? Well, it's because Senator Burr is the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. So right now, we have the person that is supposed to oversee the FBI also being investigated by the FBI. How in the world has Mitch McConnell, the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, not removed Richard Burr as the Intelligence Committee chairman? It renders the whole notion of congressional ethics a joke. I mean, you could perhaps make the argument that with Kelly Lafleur, at least she's out there proactively trying to get her conduct reviewed by the SEC. Maybe somebody else in her world made the decisions on those trades. But with Burr, he's admitted that he directed the trades. He was out there telling the American people one thing and then telling his behind the scenes friends something else. And he's got the brother-in-law who apparently had massive sell-offs the same day Burr did. And if they find out that those two were communicating, I just think that tells a very grim picture about what Burr was up to. And it's not like there's been some big defense from Burr. So I think that McConnell erodes the credibility of our intelligence process at a time when credibility needs to sort of be built up there. When you look at what they did to politicize that entity. So it'd be nice if, intelligence didn't look political, if it didn't look like Burr's kind of getting protected by the majority leader because he's a Republican. And, we don't have the biggest Republican majority over there. So I don't know. But I think that when you got something that so obviously flies in the face of honorable conduct with the American people, that there should be action when it's for self-gain, self-benefit. I think that people can make mistakes. I don't exactly want to, get into the guilt by accusation game. But here I think there's a pretty substantial case to be made that this guy doesn't need to be the chairman of the Intelligence Committee after this activity, and it's McConnell who can make it happen, and I sure hope he does. Thanks for listening to Hot Takes with Matt Gaetz. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode.